Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 11, Introduction to Verbs. We are picking up from Part 1 and now in Part 2 discussing dynamics, statives, voice, valency, and stems. And obviously we can't go in great depth in our limited period of time, but we need these discussions to ground our further investigation of the biblical Aramaic verbal system in service of biblical interpretation. More information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 80 to 87. Let's get started. Dynamic and stative verbs. Some reference materials might call dynamic verbs fientive verbs, but I think dynamic is perhaps an easier word to remember. Let's consider this picture. What the figures in the picture are doing, that statue there. Well, one way is to think of the figures that the statue represents were originally standing, and as they sat down, that sitting down action, that action right there, we could call a dynamic verb of sitting. Now, there's also a stative idea of sitting, which is what they're doing right now. The action does not have the connotation of change through time. So it's a state rather than really change, an action, in a way of categorizing verbs. So a dynamic verb is representing change through time. A stative verb is not change through time. And most English verb ideas that just naturally come to mind are dynamic. And one way of thinking about stative verbs is thinking of them adjectivally, meaning those figures are the sitting figures. They are sitting. So in sitting figures, I was using sitting in an adjectival sense of explaining which figures they were. So statives seem conceptually to have a lot to do with an adjective sort of idea. So we need to know about these two kinds of verbs because there are differences in verb meaning based on whether they're dynamic or stative in Biblical Aramaic. Okay, next, let's discuss voice and valency. Voice. We typically think of active voice as the most common kind of expression. And we're talking about grammatical voice here, where in a given sentence, such as that first example, John hit Ben, the English word order is telling us that John is the grammatical subject, Ben is the grammatical object, John is the agent. He carries out the action of hitting, and Ben is the patient. He receives the action. And this is very straightforward. Now, what about mediopassive? Well, this is a case where the agent is less agentive and in fact in a way is experiencing the action as well. So an example with John and Ben is that they often get hit as they fight, where there's not an explicit statement here of who's doing the hitting, and really once the hitting has happened, how it connects with the bodies of John and Ben in a clear way. So is each man hitting himself? Are they hitting each other? What exactly is going on here is not totally clear because the agents here are also the patients at the same time. And then we get to passive voice, where all we have is a patient. So Ben was hit. So if you see that example sentence, it's expressing something similar to the meaning of the active voice sentence. However, the agent was not necessary to express. Now we can reintroduce the agent, the hitter, John, with a prepositional phrase. But in doing so, we don't create an object for that sentence because it's a prepositional phrase that's reintroducing the agent. If we delete by John, Ben was hit is still a grammatically acceptable sentence. That's passive voice. Fronting the patient as far as its syntactical prominence is increased, where the patient is the subject grammatically. And then finally, we need to talk about reflexive voice. In a grammatical sense, the agents and patients are the same. And we get this in English with the idea of self or selves as a tag on words. So John and Ben hit themselves. So the hitter was the one being hit, or in this case, the ones being hit. Now, what's valency about? We've got voice. What's valency? Valency has to do with the number of participants in an action. So perhaps for now, we can just limit ourselves to the active voice example, and then we'll move on. The hitting in John hit Ben is a transitive idea. If all we had was John is hitting, that kind of idea, there's one participant in that action. We don't know who or what he's hitting. But if John hit Ben, now there are two participants. So we go from, we can say, a monovalent idea, John is hitting, to a bivalent idea, John hit Ben. Okay? So number of participants in an action is valency. And we're just going to see a little bit later as we discuss the biblical Aramaic verbal system how being aware of this concept in linguistics can just help us to understand what's going on in biblical Aramaic better. One thing to note before we leave voice and valency is mediopassive. I've placed it in gray because biblical Hebrew has a specific grammatical means to express the mediopassive voice, the nifal verb stem, that is not present in biblical Aramaic. Well, speaking of verb stems, pei, ayin, lamed plays an important role in our understanding of verb stems in the Semitic languages. Just by tradition, this verbal root's been chosen to give names to the verb stems. What we're going to do is we're going to continue with tradition in the respect of naming the biblical Aramaic verb stems, but we're also going to use an abbreviation system that will help us bridge the gap from Hebrew verb stem names over to biblical Aramaic verb stem names, where these two verb stems, though having different names, are playing a similar role. This is what I mean. On the left, we have letter abbreviations. So G, what's the G stem? Well, it's the Grundstamm in German, which means the basic stem. In biblical Hebrew, we know that this is the Kal. And in biblical Aramaic, it's going to be the Pa'al, which means that certain vowels that sound like Pa'al, those vowels are attached to Pei, Ayin, Lamed to produce that title. Now again, we're going to call this stem the Pa'al in our Daily Dose of Aramaic learning and in the scripture videos. However, it is helpful as we understand what Pa'al means to compare it through that abbreviation system, through G, back to the biblical Hebrew Kal. Okay? And then looking down on the chart to the D stem. The D stem is that which carries the doubled middle root consonant, which we know is the biblical Hebrew PL. The biblical Aramaic equivalent is the Pa'el. And the meaning of the doubled middle root consonant stem is complex, and it depends on the verbal root exactly what it means. Causative. Well, we're familiar with the causative idea because of the hey prefixed biblical Hebrew hifil verb stem, right? Well, there is a close equivalent of that in biblical Aramaic, the hafel. But interestingly, Aramaic also has an afel and a shafel that have, respectively, the aleph and the sheen prefixes. And then finally, we get to the noon prefix verb stem, which Aramaic does not have. Most Semitic languages have a noon prefixed verb stem, an N stem. Biblical Aramaic does not. This is the one for mediopassive reflexive uses in biblical Hebrew. Now, G, D, C, and N are important abbreviations that very quickly help us relate Hebrew and Aramaic verb stems. We need a couple more letters, and they're in the lowercase. P and T. Now, the P, when it's attached to those other letters, is designating the passive voice. So it's the so-called internal passive, the passive that's sort of created off of the active voice of that stem grouping. So what does that mean? DP. D by itself in Hebrew would have been PL. DP is Pual. Okay? So that's just what that little P is making us know it's passive voice. And T is often placed before the capital stem letter in order to represent a tav infix, which is expressing reflexive voice. This is hitpael in biblical Hebrew. So to try to illustrate that better than just merely saying it, let's use this chart where you see on the left GDC, and then the N stem is off to the side. Okay, so GDC are the main kinds of stems, and then you see the small p, small t, which are variations of G, D, and C. Now, if we supply the Hebrew names that we're familiar with, we have Kal, Piel, Hifil that are the basic G, D, and C stems. Their passive equivalents are Kal passive, Pual, and Hofal, right? And then we get over to T, the reflexive stems, and we notice that Biblical Hebrew does not have a TG stem. And the reflexive stem we're familiar with probably is the Hitpael. And then there's the special case of the Hishtafel, that verb form for the worship verb, where that particular verb only has a Hishtafel form, and respectively, Hishtafel in Biblical Hebrew only appears in that verb. So whenever you have the situation of a verb only appearing in one stem, the stem often becomes less important or determinative for the meaning of that verb in the text. The way that we can carry out some sort of analysis about what these different verb stem categories of meaning, the meaning that's imparted upon a given verb form, has to do with comparing it back to the base form normally. So that's why, since there's only a Hishtafel in the case of the worship verb in Biblical Hebrew, it means there's no G to compare it with. Okay, and then finally I've placed Nifal off to the side because it's not in the G, D, or C category, and it's going to end up not being in Biblical Aramaic, okay? But it's important to mention it right now because, interestingly, in Biblical Hebrew, there's a way to express TG. That is to say, the base idea of a verb, but a reflexive variation of it, and that's through Nifal. There are some reflexive Nifal uses, and Nifal also rushes in to take up the slack by the fact that there aren't actually that many Kal passive verbs in the Hebrew Bible. Nifal frequently functions as a passive counterpart to Kal. So Nifal works its way in to the grid that GDC creates with its passive and reflexive counterparts. Okay, over to Aramaic. Now, Aramaic, because it's a Semitic language, a related language, it has a similar distribution of verb stems, and here are the names. So first off, we see Pa'al, Pa'el, and Hafel for the G, D, and C. They have internal passives, Pa'il and Hofal, interestingly, but there's no DP, is there? We'll come back to that. There's Hit Pa'el, so an actual reflexive verb stem to express the reflexive equivalent of the G, Pa'al, Hit Pa'al, and Hishtafel, also a Hishtafel in Aramaic, but there's no Nifal, there's no end stem. Now, is it a problem that there's no means through a verb stem, a dedicated verb stem, to express the DP idea? Well, actually not. There are ways to express a DP idea in Biblical Aramaic that we're going to cover. Right now, we're mostly talking about these big picture concepts. So, since there's no end stem, let's move over this 3x3 chart, these 9 cells, to the middle, and let's talk about, for dynamic verbs, in general, what is this verb stem system telling us? Well, the T verb forms that are variants of G, D, and C can indeed be reflexive, but interestingly, they often frequently express passive voice instead of the text using the dedicated passive voice verb stems. They're not very frequently used, the Pa'il and the Hofal. So it is through this means that the DP could be expressed by Hit Pa'al. Okay? So that is an interesting dynamic going on in the Biblical Aramaic verbal system, which is very rare in Biblical Hebrew for the so-called T stems to take on the function of the P stems. Okay? Now, this comparison of the G and C is worth mentioning briefly, and that is that the C stems normally are very clearly expressing a causative variation of the G stem meaning. Now, something that is not as clear is the relationship between the G and D stems. There are certain patterns that can be discerned, but this is the most mysterious, if you will, of the relationship of verb stem meanings. And it's harder to talk about in Biblical Aramaic because we have fewer verbs. There are some verbs, for instance, that only appear in D. So we're going to be, as we actually look at biblical Aramaic verb examples, we're going to keep these general principles in mind for what meaning these verb stems are imparting to the verb forms. There are these patterns. Now, what about stative verbs? So I've taken off the P and the T stem variants to just concentrate on G, D, and C because I think this provides the clearest explanation of what the stems mean with regard to stative verbs. So G, the pa'al, for the case of stative verbs, describes the state of the subject. Clear enough. What's the pa'ld doing? Well, it typically has a factative meaning. That is to say that the verb is enacting a state upon the object. Interesting, right? So a G stative verb, a pa'al, is intransitive because it's the subject that's being affected by the state, right? But in the pa'ld, where there's a factative meaning, this is a transitive verb in which the state is being enacted upon an object. Well, what's going on with C? Well, sometimes it's kind of tempting to say that there's a causing idea going on, and you could sort of work in a causative explanation for some of this. But it really seems from comparative Semitics that the causative stem stative verbs are acting in a declarative sense, declaring the state of the object. So again, this is a transitive idea, or places the object into an ideal exemplification, sort of like a paragon state for that stative verb idea. So we're going to need some examples. First, talking about the factative idea. So let's look at the basic idea for resh beit hay, that stative verb. The tree was great. It was big. That's Daniel 4:8. But then Daniel 2:48 has then the king made Daniel great. So you can see on the right with the basic form of the stative verb, it's intransitive. It's just the subject, the tree, was great. But then over here on the left with the D stem, it's transitive. The king, subject, made great Daniel. Daniel's the object. So there's an enacting of the state upon the object. We can see that pretty clearly. Now, looking at the relationship between G and C for stative verbs, G, it is not complete. So shin, lem, lamed, mem, this verb of completeness that in Hebrew lies behind the word shalom. Okay? So it is not complete. This it is the subject. But now we get transitive. He has brought it, whatever the it is, this object, to an end. Now, of the options I have on the screen there, I believe this falls more into the elative category about placing the object, this it, into an ideal state. So the state of completeness, just as complete as this it can possibly be, he's brought it to that end. Okay? So this is stative verb stem meanings, a bit different from the dynamic ones. If we didn't have this different idea, we might be tempted to get a little bit confused because factative, the D stem, it sounds causative, but it's not. Okay? All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this very theory-laden discussion that introduces our treatment of the biblical Aramaic verbal system. You'll see in subsequent lessons how we apply these ideas. So I can't wait to study further with you.